The city was alive with its usual late-evening chaos, horns blaring, neon lights flickering, and the distant murmur of conversations blending into the hum of urban life. I had just stepped out of a coffee shop, my badge tucked safely inside. My jacket, blending in as just another ordinary citizen. Tonight wasn't supposed to be eventful, just a quiet stroll after a long day. As I made my way toward the parking lot, a shadow moved in my peripheral vision. A man, broad shoulders, stiff posture, stepped directly into my path. His expression was unreadable, but his intent was clear. Before I could react, another figure appeared behind me. The first man, who looked like he might have been security, didn't waste time. "Stop right there," he barked, his voice edged with authority. I frowned. "Is there a problem?" "ID," he demanded. No explanation, no courtesy, just cold insistence. Years of training had taught me to read people, and something about these men felt off. Their uniforms were plain, no logos, no badges, just black tactical vests. They carried themselves like law enforcement, but there was an unnatural aggression in their stance, a forcefulness that reeked of something more than protocol. A quick glance around told me we weren't alone. A few pedestrians lingered in the distance, their eyes flickering with curiosity, but no one willing to intervene. The tension thickened as the second man stepped closer, his fingers twitching slightly near his waist. Gun? Knife? It was hard to tell, but I knew a threat when I saw one. I kept my expression neutral. "Mind telling me what this is about?" "You're in a restricted area," the first man snapped. "Show your ID, now." That was a lie. I had just come from a public cafe. My instincts screamed that this wasn't a routine security check. This was targeted. But why? I exhaled slowly, my heart steady but alert. I reached into my pocket, deliberate, slow movements to avoid triggering a reaction. I could feel the weight of my badge against my fingers, but I hesitated. Not yet. Something told me this game was far from over. And I was right. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. I kept my breathing steady, my movements deliberate. Years in the field had taught me that aggression feeds off itself. Push too hard, and you'll escalate a situation faster than you can control it. So I played it cool. Reaching into my jacket, I pretended to search for my wallet, giving myself just enough time to observe them more closely. The first man, tall, thick-built, had the posture of someone used to exerting authority, but there was something unpolished about him. His uniform lacked any insignia, and his belt, though equipped, didn't have the standard issue gear I'd expect from actual law enforcement. No radio, no handcuffs. That was the first red flag. The second guy was thinner, jittery, his fingers flexing near his waistband like he was itching for something. His eyes darted around, calculating, nervous. He wasn't used to this. That was my second red flag. I pulled out my wallet and flipped it open just enough to flash an ID, my civilian one, the one that wouldn't raise any alarms. "There." Satisfied? The first man barely glanced at it before scoffing. "That's not enough. We need something official." I raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "We asked the questions," he shot back. That was red flag number 3. A real officer would have identified themselves by now. The tension thickened, like the air had been vacuum sealed around us. I could feel the energy shift. This wasn't just an overzealous security team. This was a setup. But for what? And why me? A gust of wind cut through the alley, rustling a discarded newspaper near my feet. I caught a glimpse of movement in my periphery. A third man, hanging back in the shadows, watching, waiting. My pulse slowed, my instincts sharpening. This wasn't just some routine ID check. This was an ambush. I clenched my jaw, keeping my posture relaxed. If they thought I was just another unsuspecting civilian, I had the upper hand. But if I played my cards wrong, things could spiral out of control fast. The first man took a step closer, invading my space. "You look nervous," he sneered. I met his gaze, unflinching. "You're the one sweating," I said evenly. His nostrils flared. The second guy tensed. The third man in the shadows shifted slightly, preparing to move. I had seconds to decide my next step, and something told me this was far from over. A murmur rippled through the sidewalk as passing pedestrians slowed their steps. Eyes flickered in my direction, curiosity turning to concern. A few people pulled out their phones, recording from a distance. Silent observers to whatever this was turning into. The first man noticed too, his jaw tightening. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. "You're acting real suspicious," he said, his voice louder now, designed to be heard by onlookers. "Makes me wonder what you're hiding." I exhaled, slowly, keeping my expression unreadable. "I already showed you my ID." "That wasn't good enough," the second man snapped. "We need to verify." Verify? That was laughable. If they had any real authority, they'd be running my name by now, calling in details over the radio, but they weren't. Because they couldn't. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A woman in a red coat whispered something to the man beside her. A teenager lifted his phone higher, ensuring a clear shot. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Everyone watching, waiting, wondering how this would play out. And then the false accusations started. "We got a report about someone matching your description involved in fraudulent activity," the first man declared, crossing his arms. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" I felt my jaw tighten. Classic tactic. Create doubt. Paint me as the bad guy before I even get a chance to defend myself. I had seen it before, seen how quickly people jump to conclusions. When an accusation is thrown into the air, no proof required. The second man leaned in. "Just hand over everything in your pockets, and we'll clear this up." My pulse quickened, but not with fear. With calculation. I had two options. Reveal my badge now and flip the script, or keep playing along and gather more information. My fingers brushed against the edge of my wallet. One movement, one flash of my credentials, and this entire situation would shift, but something in my gut told me to wait, to see how far they were willing to push. The first man glanced at the crowd, noticing the growing number of cameras pointed in our direction. That made him uneasy. Good. He was worried about optics, which meant he wasn't reckless. He had something to lose. I took a slow step forward, closing the gap between us. "You sure you want to do this?" I asked, my voice low, controlled. For the first time I saw it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But the second guy? He was still itching for a fight, and I knew this was about to get worse before it got better. The second man squared his shoulders, stepping even closer, his breath hot with frustration. "We're done playing games," he hissed. "Hand over everything now." His aggression was ramping up, but I wasn't rattled, because I had just spotted my first real crack in their story. The first man, the one who had been leading the charge, shifted his vest slightly, and for the first time I caught a glimpse of what was supposed to be a badge clipped to his belt. At a glance, it might have passed as official, but I had been in this game too long to miss the details. The shine was off, the engraving too shallow. And more importantly, it didn't belong to any legitimate agency I recognized. Fake adrenaline spiked through me, but I kept my expression steady. If they weren't real law enforcement, then who were they? Private security? Dirty cops? Or something worse? Scammers preying on civilians, too scared to question their authority? I needed to be sure. "You guys must be new," I said, tilting my head slightly. "You didn't even ask for a secondary form of identification. No radio check. No call into dispatch?" I gave a small, knowing smirk. "What kind of operation are you running here?" The first man's jaw twitched. The second man flinched. That was all the confirmation I needed. Still, they weren't backing down. The leader recovered quickly, rolling his shoulders like he was brushing off my words. "We don't have to explain anything to you," he shot back. "You're the one under suspicion here," I scoffed. "Suspicion of what exactly?" The second guy jumped in, his voice laced with forced confidence. "Like we said, reports of fraudulent activity. Could be identity theft, stolen credit, cards, maybe even impersonating law enforcement." His lips curled slightly. "Wouldn't that be ironic?" Ah. So that was their play. A sloppy attempt to make me second-guess myself, turn the pressure back on me. I had seen con men use this tactic before, confuse the mark, make them question their own innocence until they give in out of sheer frustration, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I let out a slow breath, my stance shifting just slightly. It wasn't a movement they would recognize, but in my line of work it meant something very clear. I was done playing. I took another step forward, closing the distance. "You know what I think?" I said. My voice, quieter now, meant only for them. "I think you two are bluffing," the leader scoffed, but his eyes flickered with something else. Uncertainty. I pressed on. "See, if you were real law enforcement, you'd know proper detainment procedures. You'd know that accusing someone without reading them their rights is a legal disaster waiting to happen." I nodded toward his belt. "And that badge? I've seen better fakes at a toy store." The second man tensed, his fingers twitching toward his waistband. My instinct screamed that we were at the breaking point. They weren't going to let this go easily, and I wasn't about you to walk away. I exhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral. I had them. They didn't know it yet, but the game had already shifted in my favor. Instead of panicking, I decided to play along, tilting my head like I was actually considering their ridiculous accusations. "All right," I said, slipping my wallet back into my pocket. "Let's say I believe you. Let's say you're real officers just doing your job. Humor me. What exactly was the description you got?" The first man hesitated. Just for a second, a blink and you'll miss it moment. But I caught it. The second guy, the more impatient of the two, jumped in too fast. "Tall, dark jacket, suspicious behavior." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Yeah, that really narrows it down." I gestured toward the crowd. "I count at least 3 other people here fitting that description." The first guy shot his partner a look, just a flicker of frustration, but it was enough to tell me they hadn't planned for this level of pushback. They were improvising, and they were terrible at it. I folded my arms. "And where's the report? You got a case number, a witness statement, anything at all?" The second man opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The first guy stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Listen, we don't have to explain anything to you. That's not how this works." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, that's exactly how it works." The tension crackled between us, thick and suffocating. They were running out of ways to keep up this charade. I could feel it. The crowd could feel it. And they knew it. Still, the first man clenched his fists, doubling down one last time. "Enough! Hand over your ID, now!" I smiled. There it was, the perfect moment. Slowly, deliberately, I reached inside my jacket. The second man tensed, his fingers twitching near his waistband like he was ready to make a move. A rookie mistake. His nerves were getting the best of him. I let the silence stretch, just for a second, just enough to make them sweat. Then, in one fluid motion, I pulled out my badge and flipped it open. The moment they saw it, everything changed. The second man's face drained of color. The first man took half a step back, trying to mask his shock with a forced scowl. But he wasn't fooling anyone. I took my time, letting them absorb what just happened. Then, with a voice as calm as ever, I said, "Now, why don't we start? This conversation over?" The crowd gasped. The phones were still recording. And for the first time since this whole thing started, they were the ones caught in the trap. For a moment, everything froze. The air between us felt electric, charged, with the weight of what had just happened. The second man's lips parted slightly, his breath shaky, his eyes darting between me and my badge as if searching for some kind of loophole, some way to undo what he'd just seen. The first man recovered faster, but not fast enough. His jaw clenched, his posture stiffened, but I caught it, that flicker of fear. He knew they'd made a mistake, a big one. I held my badge steady, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of my authority sink in. "Special agent," I said finally, my voice controlled, measured. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words hit them like a punch to the gut. A ripple of hushed whispers ran through the crowd. Phones were still pointed in our direction, recording every second, every reaction. This wasn't just an ID check gone wrong anymore. This was something bigger. I took a slow step forward. This time, they were the ones backing up. "So," I said, my voice calm but sharp, "let's talk about why you two have been impersonating law enforcement." The second man flinched, shaking his head. We never said—" "Oh, you did," I cut in smoothly. "You demanded ID, claimed to be investigating fraud. You even implied I was a suspect. I tilted my head, my eyes narrowing. But you never identified yourselves. No official badges. No department ID numbers. And let's not forget the part where you tried to take my wallet. The second guy opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked to his partner, desperate for guidance. But the first man stayed quiet, his mind racing for a way out. I gave them nothing. No mercy, no space to breathe. Instead, I pulled out my phone. How about I make a call? See if any real officers in the area recognize you. That got a reaction. The first man's eyes darkened, his fists curling at his sides. Cornered animals always make one last desperate move, and I was ready for it. You think flashing a badge means you run the show? He snarled, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. I held his gaze. No. But breaking federal law means you don't. Silence. Thick, unforgiving. Then, finally, the first man exhaled, his shoulders lowering slightly. The bravado was slipping. He knew the game was up, but something told me this wasn't over just yet. The first man exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He wasn't trying to intimidate me anymore. He was calculating, searching for an exit. The second guy, though, was crumbling fast. His hands twitched at his sides, his breathing uneven. And then I saw it. Guilt. Not the kind you fake when you're bluffing your way out of a bad situation. No, this was deeper. This was the kind of guilt that only comes when you realize you've been caught in something bigger than you can control. I narrowed my eyes. You're not just some wannabe tough guy shaking people down, are you? I said, my voice low, measured. This is organized. The first man's nostrils flared. The second man swallowed hard. I pressed on. What's the endgame here? A few stolen wallets? Scamming tourists? No, this is bigger than that. I turned, slightly, making sure my voice carried to the growing crowd. These two aren't just impersonating law enforcement. They're running a con, one that likely involves identity theft, bank fraud, maybe worse. The murmurs grew louder. The phones stayed up, cameras rolling. I could feel the shift. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were witnesses, and that was when the first man snapped. You talk too much, he growled. Then, in one quick motion, his hand darted toward his belt. I moved faster. Before he could even think about pulling a weapon, I had him spun around, his arm wrenched behind his back. He let out a sharp hiss of pain as I forced him to his knees. The second man took a step back, his hands raised instinctively. Don't, I warned, my tone ice cold. He didn't. He knew it was over. I turned my attention back to the first man, tightening my grip just enough to make sure he knew he wasn't going anywhere. Let me guess, I said, keeping my voice just loud enough for the crowd to hear. You run fake security checks, steal IDs, empty accounts, and disappear before anyone realizes what happened. But today, you picked the wrong person. Weight of my badge, still glinting in the streetlights, was proof enough. And just as the real police sirens wailed in the distance, I leaned in, whispering so only he could hear. You should have asked for my ID sooner. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue, bouncing off the glass windows around us. The first man struggled under my grip, his breathing ragged with frustration. He wasn't scared. No, he was furious. Not because he was caught, but because he hadn't expected to lose. The second guy? He was done. His hands stayed up, his shoulders sagged in quiet surrender. He knew the game was over. The patrol cars screeched to a stop, doors swinging open as uniformed officers poured out. Two of them rushed toward me. One look at my badge, and they knew who was in control of this situation. Special Agent, one of them addressed me. What's going on here? I yanked the first man to his feet and handed him over. These two have been running an impersonation. Scam? Shaking down people? Stealing identities? Who knows what else? I suggest you dig deep. The officer nodded and turned to the second guy, who was already holding out his wrists, too tired to fight. But just as the first man was being hauled toward the squad car, he twisted his head to look at me, eyes burning with something unreadable. Then he smirked. This isn't over, he said, voice low, venomous. You have no idea what you just stepped into. And just like that, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, I watched as they shoved him into the car, his words echoing in my head. Was this really just a couple of low-level conmen? Or had I just scratched the surface of something much bigger? The crowd began to disperse, people lowering their phones, whispering amongst themselves. Some looked relieved, others intrigued. This was the kind of thing they'd talk about for weeks. I glanced at my badge, still gripped in my hand. Tonight had been a reminder. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a uniform. As the squad cars pulled away, I stood, in the glow of the streetlights, the city humming around me, knowing one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your support means the world.